Okay, hi there. Welcome to another video. We're going to be taking a look at how to build really good KAA and evaluation paragraphs to a particular question. This time the question is about trade liberalization and the economic impact of an increase in an import quota. So the question is, examine the likely impact on different stakeholders of increasing an import quota. Good example is just a few days ago where China announced it was going to increase the import quota for Cambodian rice from 300,000 tonnes to 400,000 tonnes per year. Of course, a quota is a non-tariff barrier. The question does say increasing a quota. A lot of students, they get a question on quotas or tariffs, assume that there wasn't one before and it's been put in place. This question is about increasing a quota. Very important to read the question carefully. Just in the news again the last few days, Australia has had some of its exports of coal blocked in China as the Chinese authorities try to increase the domestic price of coal to support their coal mines. Here is the question: examine the likely impact on different stakeholders of increasing an import quota. Always good to start with a definition. It helps the examiners have confidence in you, that you know precisely what a term is. A quota is a limit, a cap, if you like, on the volume or the quantity of imports that you can bring into a country in a given time period. And it's an example of a non-tariff barrier. Good precise definition. A quota has the effect of restricting supply, leading to higher prices. My example is drawn from the one that we just showed. China had a quota on Cambodian rice, for example. The words in red here are connective phrases. They help bind the answer together. We like them here. Therefore, one consequence of increasing a quota is that competition in the domestic market will increase because you're allowing more imports in to the sector, assuming that imports can be supplied at a lower marginal cost, if you like, a lower supply price, then a greater quantity of imports will enter a country's market. My analysis diagram shows how this is likely to lead to a fall in market price and an expansion of domestic demand. Pardon me. This will then lead to, a nice connected phrase, this will then lead to an increase in consumer surplus, causing a gain in economic welfare. Consumers will see a rise in their real incomes. Keywords there in blue: non-tariff barrier, consumer surplus, marginal cost. If you can put those terms in your answer, you're going to get very good KA marks because you're using the concepts of economics. And there's a nice chain of reasoning there. The diagram, of course, will be key to this. There are actually different ways of showing an import quota on the on the YouTube, for example. Different people do different ways. This is my preferred approach. So let's take the market for rice, for example. If there was no quota, you could presumably import rice at the free trade price. There's a domestic supply from domestic producers. There's a domestic demand from consumers. So you could import the difference between Q1 and Q2 if you could allow import in tariff or quota free, because other countries can produce the good more cheaply. If you impose a quota, you're basically saying we're going to allow domestic supply plus a certain quantity. So we shift the supply curve a little bit to the right, dependent on the size of the quota. Result is that this curve now becomes effectively the supply curve. You can't supply at the free trade price. The price goes up to the new higher price. At the higher price, domestic demand contracts to Q3. Domestic producers can now supply Q4, and the gap between Q3 and Q4 is met by imports filling up their quota. Now, if you relax the quota, if you increase the quota, you're saying you're going to allow in more imports. So we can now shift that supply curve out a little bit further. Here's domestic supply with the higher quota. Hopefully you can see that. We've shifted it out a bit further. Result is now that the price will come down to this new low price here because you've increased the supply to the market. Good news for consumers. They can now buy more, Q5. But not as good for domestic producers because at this new lower price they can only profitably supply Q6. The gap, Q6 to Q5, is again met by imports. They fill up their quota. So that will be quite a good analysis diagram to use as the building block around your answer to this question. It depends where you want to put it into the answer. I suggest just one big half a side of A4 diagram to really show what's going on here. Make it nice and clear what you think is happening. And at A level these days, the quality of the diagrams does make a big difference. If you wanted to go further with this diagram, really a lot further, you could then show the gains in consumer and producer welfare, consumer surplus, producer surplus. You probably have to then use labels at different points. I won't do that in this video because I just wanted to work through with you some examples of how to build paragraphs to get great marks. So there's my KA point. If I just flip back here, there's my KA point, which is a chain of reasoning lumped together into one chunky paragraph there. Then you leave 2 lines. Always leave a couple of lines between paragraphs because it helps separate out the answer and then make your evaluation point. My evaluation point this time is the extent to which consumers benefit from lower prices depends on how big is the rise in the quota. It could be the case, for example, in a market that imports are a relatively small percentage of the market. So even if you relaxed the quota and got rid of it completely, it wouldn't make a big difference to price. The impact also depends on whether this is a trade liberalisation just applied to one country. So Cambodia, for example, is allowed to export a little bit more rice into China. Or is it applied to many different countries? For example, if we get rid of quotas on sugar or textiles, that's going to have a much bigger effect than if the quota relaxation is applied to just one country on its own. That's my evaluation point. Interestingly, I don't know if you're going to think about this for the exam, but some students are now labelling their paragraphs as KAA and evaluation. So they're putting KAA before the first paragraph, a couple of lines, then the evaluation. That's quite a fierce thing to do. It's see what your teachers think about that. My second point, because we asked to talk about the likely impact on different stakeholders, is to focus on domestic producers. Increasing a quota is also likely to have an impact on domestic producers of the product to which the quota was applied. Again, a connective phrase here. This is because a tight quota, a small quota, gives domestic firms a lot of protection from cheaper imports, and higher prices increases their producer surplus. Thus, one effect of increasing the quota is that you're making the market for rice, for textiles, for sugar, for example, more contestable. Good word to use from A2 Micro. If imports can now flow into the market at a cheaper price, then we might expect to see some expenditure switching effects take place. In other words, consumers will shift their spending towards cheaper imports, and this may cause a contraction in demand for domestic output. My analysis diagram shows this is likely to cut revenues for domestic producers. Their output, as we showed in the diagram, goes down and may cause some to leave the market. Perhaps if they're getting a price now which is below their variable cost, they can't even afford to make normal profit. So this is my second KAA point. Again, it's a chain of reasoning using connective words. This is because, this means that. My diagram shows. These are the little phrases, if you put into your writing, will really help bind a really good paragraph together. Then we leave a couple of lines. Here's my second KAA point merged into one. Evaluation point 2 is one of my favourite evaluation phrases. In theory, domestic producers might suffer from a higher quota, but in practice, or in reality if you like, they might respond by increasing labour productivity, which in other words boosts their efficiency, which might help them become more cost competitive against imports and allow them to satisfy more of domestic demand. They might also take some steps to better their non-price competitiveness. They might focus on product quality, design, environmental footprint, other factors other than the price, which are important to consumers when making a purchase decision. As long as the evaluation point here relates back to the KA point, you're going to be in great shape. So there we go. There's our diagram again, which you can show the effect. But if you really want to go to town, then you would probably put in the effect on consumer and producer surplus. What I've tried to show you in our video today is how to build really strong KAA paragraphs and then complementary evaluation paragraphs. Separate them out, and under time conditions you can write a fantastic exam answer. Thanks for joining in on this video.